Cultures are some of the greatest and hardest things to world build. When done right, they are the secret sauce that makes a world feel real, and when done wrong, they give your writing the texture and aroma of cement. Gray, sludgy, and not a whole lot of fun to dive into. I've written a culture or two and have done another video on this subject, though that one had a bit of a different approach, and now I would like to impart some of the best practices I've learned in the hopes that they might help you think up some new and cool ideas, or at least be amused by my stupid examples. But to get us started, I was once in a class that was about fantasy writing, and my professor got a marker out and stood before the board and asked us, "What is culture?" He had us listing all sorts of different things until almost the entire board was filled with different concepts. Food, language, music, holidays, religions, manners, ethics, systems of governments, economics, weapons, clothing. These are all culture in some way or another. All that unites culture as a concept is its being the practice of life as seen in a bespoke group of people, whatever that might mean or look like. And considering all of that, considering that everything around us is culture, from the desk you may be sitting at to the floor under your feet and the walls around you, even if you're watching this outside, even the way that human structures are built into and around nature is culture. It can feel overwhelming to try to figure out what culture is without writing an encyclopedia of relevant concepts for every group you might world build, with further entries for all the subcultures of those cultures. It might seem like an endless task. And so that which follows will be my advice intended largely for fantasy world building, but ideally this should function for sci-fi civilizations as well, in case you're writing any glup shittos that you need to populate your galaxy of spacefarers. So the first concept I want to talk about for us a bit here is called the level of divergence. The level of divergence, as I'm defining it here, is basically how different the culture you're writing is from that which your audience will intuitively understand. As you might guess, this isn't exactly a hard science, and it's going to depend a lot on who your audience is. A writer from Finland incorporating pieces of Finnish culture into their world building might have those elements be overlooked or thought of as entirely new concepts by an audience member who is from Indonesia, for example, and vice versa. However, this is something to keep in mind relative to how much you want to elaborate on your culture. World building a culture successfully does not mean that you actually need that whole cyclopedia and that it needs to be explored in extreme depth in whatever project it is you're working on. Just that the audience will buy into it and believe in it as part of your world. Extra stuff beyond that is valuable, and we'll be talking about it, but it's fundamentally frosting on the cake to make your world seem richer, which is nice, but not always mandatory for competent writing. A culture that is both extremely foreign to the writer, but not elaborated upon, might leave them feeling that the story's missing something. If you write a culture that appears really interesting and does a lot of things that the audience doesn't expect or isn't familiar with, but then you just kind of drop it, then it might feel to the audience that you've missed an opportunity to do something interesting. However, if you basically just write literal ancient Roman culture, change nothing about it, and then elaborate upon it extensively, at that point you might as well just be writing historical fiction. When thinking about the level of divergence carefully, you can use it to fill in the blanks in certain areas. Say you're writing a culture based in some way on the Norse, as there often tends to be in most fantasy worlds, whether they're Skyrim's Nords, Warhammer's Norskins, or even the Kargans from Earthsea or the Outlanders of the Farseer trilogy. Just by introducing concepts of the northern pagan raider or something adjacent to that in an archetype, the audience will essentially understand what it is you're doing with that culture, which can be both a good and a bad thing. It's good because it saves you time and establishes a baseline of understanding that means you don't need to elaborate on them extensively right away, and the audience will tend to remember what they are easier. They can act and they can fulfill their role in the story smoothly because the audience will know what kind of group they're supposed to be. But that's also why doing this is kind of a negative. They may struggle to be differentiated from other such groups in other pieces of media, and thus may prove to be one of the worst things of all, which is boring. On the other hand, if you're writing something totally peculiar, say magical industrialists based on a combination of the Maori and Sami peoples, you're combining a decent amount of interesting concepts into one whole. However, it's unlikely to be understood all that intuitively by most people, and they'll need a little bit more building up before what they actually are will solidly exist in the mind of the reader. It is, naturally, the opposite situation. Good because they should be interesting, but also introduces some difficulties in really establishing what they are elegantly. But any of these can work so long as you understand what it is you want to get across to the audience and how. And so that leads us to the next step, which is basically just to go deeper, to explore what that culture is in your context. If you've got one based on more familiar concepts, you're going to want to focus on making them unique so they stand out from that familiarity. If they're based on unfamiliar concepts, you might want to further out those concepts that make them stand out and find ways to make them familiar to the reader, or to get them across in ways that the reader can understand quickly. It's at this point, especially if you're working on a culture that dangerously approaches being pretty tropey, to determine where you're going with your further inspiration for it. You can introduce a lot of unexpected elements this way that'll help them stand out. If you take Rob and Hobbs Outlander's, despite having the bearing of Vikings, they also have a lot to them that suggests inspiration from coastal North American natives. Alternatively, you can really dig into the initial historical inspiration and pull things out of it people might not expect. If you write Vikings and they're all horned helmets and dying for Valhalla, not only are they going to be tropey, but remarkably distant from that which you claim to take inspiration from. As if you do something like that, you aren't even really taking inspiration from the real Norse or Vikings, but from the pop culture conception of the Norse. If you want Norse-ish characters and want them to still feel that way but be interesting, then it's time to pick up a history book and start studying. Incorporate a type of complexity and depth that other worlds' Norse-ish characters don't get, and you'll produce something that manages to still be interesting while maintaining the core vibe you're going for. Just make sure to actually adapt what it is you're making into your world, or you'll end up with that whole might as well be writing historical fiction kind of deal. And of course, the same thing goes if you pull in other elements. If you instead add the Maori elements to your Norse-ish raiders, don't just give them accents and change their skin tone. Study the Maori and figure out how unique aspects of their culture could synthesize with the position you're putting them in within your world. And that last bit is, of course, the most important, especially if this isn't the first culture you're making. Regardless of what you're taking inspiration from, making a culture, or any type of culture, make sense within your world's context will do a lot of the work for you. Sure, Vikings are a certain way if they sail down from a northern peninsula onto southern temperate forests, but what if your Viking-esque characters live in a desert in the west, and that desert rests not on an ocean but floats in the sky, and they must ride wyverns to reach their targets, because that is actually the context that your world exists in. Already, you've done a lot to differentiate them just by looking at the triangular hole that your story needs filled and cutting the square-pegged Vikings into that triangle. And while we're on that topic, and as I've been using a culture like the Old Norse as my example, let's pivot to the point of perspective. Even if you're just building a world from a bird's eye view and not really intending to write too many stories in it, but obviously and especially if you are intending to write stories in the world you're making, culture that is something that is experienced far more than it's something that simply is. Those Viking-like civilizations I've been prattling on about have been my example to lead up to this specifically because they tend to be portrayed solely as an antagonistic force. Not without reason, there really aren't any ways to argue that raiding coastal towns, plundering the weak and slaughtering the strong is actually particularly heroic, as much as we might enjoy stories about Vikings. But the point is that a character from that Viking civilization is going to have a completely, almost entirely foreign conception of what their culture is like than the people they are raiding are going to have on them. Not only is that because the raider people group will be the one taking and not the one being taken from, but because it's fairly likely that their cultural morals and ethics are going to be different. They might see their actions as simply doing what's necessary to survive and thrive, or that those too weak to defend their gold and their territory deserve to lose it. Their targets are not particularly likely to agree with that perspective, naturally, but the way you write your cultures is going to also depend on what perspective they'll be seen from. On the one hand, even if a culture is only going to be experienced by outsiders from it or even enemies to it in your writing, it's good to write complexity into that culture's values more than, they're just bad guys, I guess. Not only because adding that complexity will just make your writing more interesting, but also because if you don't do that, it might come off that even you, as the writer, are subject to your own world's propaganda about this fictional enemy you've written. If you really do just write them to be completely villainous and one-dimensional without a particularly good reason, they're gonna come off as both a little bit ridiculous and uninteresting, especially if that sort of feeling doesn't fit with your story's tone. And that doesn't mean that whatever group you're writing needs to be secretly misunderstood or secretly in the right overall. Raiders pillaging and murdering people is still bad even if they have a decent reason to do it. The important thing here is just that they have that reason. Even if it's not that much of a culture you're writing and more like a cult of demon worshippers whose literal only value is seeing the world explode, even they can benefit from having other facets to them. No matter how numberless the raider horde is, someone back home has to be farming the corn or fishing for trout when they're home. Someone has to weave the fibers of their shirts together and cobble their shoes. Someone has to have the mastery to forge their weapons and armor. Someone has to entertain them with tales and drink. Someone has to keep the peace at home so they can actually organize well enough to attack other groups in the first place. And it's on that note I want to move to covering some of those crucial cultural features I discussed at the video's very beginning, starting with entertainment. One of the weakest things, the most egregious of things about underwritten cultures, particularly those that are antagonistic, is that it comes off as if the literal only joy in their lives is attacking people and generally causing trouble. This might work if it's a culture that is fundamentally not made up of humans. An insectoid hive mind's drone probably isn't going to be a member of their local bowling league, but a person, a fully realized conscious being, whether human or elf or orc or whatever, has to have something to do with their downtime. Even if it's simple and they just drink themselves half to death all the time. Even if going out and killing is really their favorite thing, the way the culture expresses itself through its entertainment is one of the key ways to show those values. If we humans were actually all characters in one big book of the universe, what we're doing right now, both us talking about writing these stories and worlds for entertainment, and you watching this video both as entertainment and slightly for the sake of learning something, are participating in our shared culture around entertainment. Just as one example, but a good one I encourage you to steal, is that oral epic poetry is a great point of entertainment for a culture of all kinds, but particularly, as you might guess, for non-literate cultures. I emphasize this because it's usually cultures that are written to be non-literate that end up getting the short end of the stick when it comes to their development in terms of entertainment and the like. At least how we tend to see them written. If you're writing about a literate culture, it's no trouble coming up with all sorts of famous names for playwrights and novelists and troubadours and so on and so forth, with well-recorded libraries of their works available for the people to see and experience and so on. But with non-literate cultures, people tend to kind of draw a blank and end up not doing that much with them. Oral epic poetry, however, is both fairly common across the world and also a great way of demonstrating that culture's values. These are often tales of their great heroes, of those who are the absolute peak of what they believe a person should be, and often even contain references to those things they consider most important about their history, even if they don't record it down in writing in other ways. Even if you're writing something like stereotypically antagonist, like a ravening orc horde or something like that, imagine how much more interesting you could make them if one of them is tasked with remembering the tale of the famous warlord Grimbad Thicktusk or whatever, and he talks about it every chance he gets. This also lends to a discussion on a culture's valuing of history. Every culture, to some degree, values history, but in showing what parts of their history they celebrate most, you'll be able to tell a lot not only about what that culture values, but also what events have occurred in their past to shape them most profoundly. A culture's greatest holiday celebrating their independence from a large empire tells you a lot about them right away. On the other hand, if their greatest holiday celebrates the conquering exploits of their most successful successful warlord, that also tells you something. If it's a religious holiday, you'll not only see what religious event might have inspired the holiday and the religion in general, but also the value that said culture places in that religion in an everyday kind of context. Is that holiday really the only time that that culture actually cares about their religion and it's mostly ceremonial at this point? Or is it just one expression of a particularly devout culture? And if you're going to have a holiday, it's not possible for a celebration of a holiday to be any good if you don't have food. Food culture is as crucial to culture as anything else, especially since in pre-modern civilizations in particular, food makes up a huge portion of the economy, and almost a majority of people's livelihoods are in some way related to the production of food. Often this can be represented in as simple of ways as coastal people being used to saltwater fish as a staple food, and so if they move inland, a greater presence of agricultural or even freshwater fish-based foods might be strange to them. At its peak, you can use the unique properties of your world or its magic to create new types of food items, or ones you wouldn't expect in that type of setting normally. Perhaps in a world with common ice magic, snow cones or other frozen treats of some form could exist, for example, things that in reality only came to be as common as they are now thanks to modern refrigeration. Drinking culture, both in terms of what substance people ferment to make alcohol with, because there's always something, and also in terms of how they quite literally stay hydrated during the day, is another consideration. In the medieval times, it wasn't uncommon for beer to be a fundamental part of many meals. It was dense and not at all like modern beer, not even very alcoholic, but it was a staple item in keeping people alive. And given the economic value inherent to food, how the economy is handled is also cultural, and yet another thing I want to briefly touch on. Thinking about what resources this culture has easy access to will not only allow you to figure out what they might specialize in. A mountain people might trade in iron if those mountains are rich with ore, a grassland people might trade in wool if they have good pastures for herding sheep and so on, but also this helps you determine what kinds of relationships they might have with their neighbors. Typically, resource-rich environments are going to create more settled peoples who will trade broadly. Those living in scarcer environments might be more likely to be nomadic or to raid and take from others to sustain themselves. Those on coasts are naturally going to rely more on fishing than those further inland, and might also make much more of their money out of seaborne trade. And if you've got money flowing, then the question is, to whom? Is there a merchant class distinct or emerging from the others? Is all this trade income merely funneling into the coffers of the local ruler? Or is it a land of smaller groups of free people plying their trades? Is serfdom prevalent among the peasantry, and does that lowest class, whatever it might actually look like, have any or many rights within their society? In terms of war, then, which classes are called up to fight? Are there upper-class knight-esque people who lead the way into conflict and are charged with the defense of their estates? Or is there enough societal organization that conscription is feasible? Is conscription even legal? Would attempts to enact it result in a rebellion because the king is attempting to force members of a small and mistreated ethnic group to serve in a conflict they have no interest in? There's all sorts of little interactions and conflicts you can get, even when thinking about how a hypothetical conflict would be fought by this culture. As you can see by this never-ending barrage of social concepts that flow into one another, a path drawn from holidays all the way to the implementation of the draft, everything in a culture is interlinked. While that will make the end product pretty complex, and thus make completing one of your own rather complex, you'll find that when doing this yourself, things tend to flow naturally into one another, as I just attempted to demonstrate. Once the inherent underlying logic both of your world and what you want this culture to look like is laid out, picking up momentum and figuring out how certain parts of the culture will logically follow isn't going to be as difficult as it might seem at first. To close out this video, I want to address a few structural things, which, though maybe not as exciting, are probably as, if not more, important. Namely, that once you do find this process for yourself, whatever it might look like and whatever cultural factors you focus on most, follow that structure for your other cultures that you work on. That sounds like very obvious advice on the outset, but there's a little more to it than the obvious. It will, for one, make it a lot easier to create more of them. It's a lot easier to drive on a road that's already been paved. But more importantly, it will prevent you from getting too lazy about any of your cultures. In that incredibly overperforming video on lazy world building I made, 99% chance that unless this is the first video of mine you've seen, you either found me through it or have at least seen it. I talk about how one of the biggest hallmarks of bad world building is that primary cultures, particularly primary protagonist cultures, get all the depth and attention, and their enemies and other places meant to be seen as exotic are ultimately boiled down to a few simple overarching ideas that make them feel shallow. It's one thing if a culture you write isn't explored all that much in a story because it isn't all that present, but you should still do the work to develop it well, because in those brief moments it is mentioned, your audience will be able to tell, and you'll be able to employ bits of deeper details that hint towards a nuanced culture, and not something you just slap together because you were too busy creating your kingdom of Protagnia. The other thing that keeping a consistent method will help you accomplish is also helping to ensure that your cultures fit and feel like they belong with each other in the same world. I know, because I've been guilty of thinking about doing these sorts of things, that sometimes you get an idea in your head for something new to add to your world because you're inspired by something you really like, but that thing that you were inspired by, and thus the thing you're now creating, is kind of outside the wheelhouse of the genre you're working in. Not only might you end up creating something shallow and reflective of someone else's work rather than your own ideas, but you also create something that may not actually fit the logic of your world. But if you're following the same process as you did for your other, more successful and original cultures, you're more likely to either realize that what you're doing probably doesn't belong, or to be inspired to actually make the necessary changes for it both to fit in your world and for it to become more of your own creation. But that all said, we should be about done for today. Anyway, if this sounds like a place you want to be, we have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want it, where we post all our videos early. As we close out, I'd like to thank our patrons: Shadowrunners, Sani, Isaac Parrott, Raymond, Don, Sadako, Cavalier, and Sazabi of the Knights of the Inner Circle, Vion and Jody on Void, our Knights, and Greer, TOW, Craig, Victoria, Lauren, and Noah, our loyal squires. And remember, even your evil demon-worshipping cultists may still celebrate their birthdays.